Thank you again, Dr. Jonathan Tran, for your excellent talk. And once again, Professor Debbie Jin will be our time checker with 2-minute warning. And we have a bell. And let me introduce to you Dr. Charlene Jin Lee. She is a professor at a neighboring school right across from Fuller Theological Seminary, San Francisco Theological Seminary, my denominational seminary, Southern California. She went to Harvard and she went to Virginia Union, and I think I'm going to just cut introduction short and move right in. So, Charlene.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Herdig. I wish to respond to this morning's lecture by offering limited exploration on two concerns. The first one, Dr. Tran's concern about a lack of a generative Asian American theology. A second concern that I see as missing, but needful in this discussion, a gender analysis of an emerging Asian American theology. Dr. Tran posits that the future of Asian American Christianity rests on the Asian American Church's readiness to claim her theological agency, the Church's readiness to articulate her particular understanding of God revealed in the record of Scripture, to describe her experience of God dwelling among the often schizophrenic self and political identities, floating somewhere between belongingness and exclusion. Readiness to illumine a prophetic imagination of God whose vastness sustains humility in all theological articulations. Claiming this theological agency as a church connected to a complicated slice of the human community we've named Asian American means to take a seat at the table of theological discourse and to announce a theology. It has been long recognized, at least I hope I'm right about this assessment, that it is quite presumptuous to speak of theology with a capital T, as if there were only one. As if there were a canon of orthodoxy that prescribed how human persons are to know God. It has almost become cliché to talk about the relationship between one's locus theologicus and one's beliefs about God. To talk about how the place from which we read the world affects how we read the Word. Yet I am suspicious that in some ways these ideas of the multi-sidedness of theology have been nothing more than an exercise and cordial welcome of diversity. Christian theological discourse at large has and has had at its center a canon of theology derived from Western ideological principles described by Western, namely European, namely white, namely male voices. Theologies emerging from different places described by different voices are assigned to peripheral positions. Imagine with me the seating table, at the seating assignment or arrangement at the table of theological discourse. The table is fairly large, I would say. Many of the seats have already been taken up and warmed for a long time, for centuries in fact, by the same people. And we study them. In our courses, we assign textbooks and ask you to write papers that seek to understand their conversations. You and I might find an open seat at this table, and we may be hesitant to speak. For it may take some time to figure out what they are talking about. For those guys who've been warming up those seats for so long, have established a lingo, a way of thinking, a way of being that is unfamiliar to us. So we sit quietly saying to ourselves, wow, we have so much to learn about theology. Allow me to remind you at this point that they are not owners of theology. Theology does not belong to one language, nor to one set of categories. The way that you speak to me, the way you speak to your families about the stories of your experience of a living God, that indeed is theological language. We have mistakenly assumed the center as if it were the original point of view. Paul exhorts, don't be so proud. Don't be so proud to think that you are entitled to a seat at the table. The original branches were broken off, and you, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in their place to share the rich root of the olive tree. Those at the center of the theological discourse, to whom we also assign the dominant position, are wild olive shoot, as are we. We, who feel like we're the newly arrived foreigners trying to fit in, nervously formulating something worthwhile to say. All of us around the table are unintended guests, equally not belonging, but by grace invited. And so it can only be with gratitude and humility that any one of us engages in theological inquiry. It can only be that we look to one another for mutual dialogue and not by the hierarchical categories assigned by the sociopolitical histories that have shaped a lopsided power dynamic. Dr. Tran's call for a generative Asian American theology has indeed been met by theologians invested in carving out a space for a seat at this table. Most of this space, however, has been taken up by a descriptive theology, describing our non-prominent position, the marginal position in light of the center position filled by, as Dr. Tran names it, white Christianity. Google marginal, margin, marginalization, and Asian American theology, Christianity, and you will find plenty to read and to learn. Dr. Tran in his lecture describes the invisibility of the Asian American Christianity and asks for mainstream Christianity and its organizations, like the North American Evangelical Seminaries, to pay some attention to our presence and to our voice. I think we have named and described our marginality for a long time. I am anxious to see us move from a descriptive theology to a constructive theology that debunks the mistaken assumptions about the seating arrangements and invites others to a kind of theologizing that is marked by a posture of humility and gratitude. Precisely the kind of theologizing that does not rely on an over and against paradigm. Perhaps what we need is a theological Copernican revolution to realize that we do not exist as an accessory orbiting around this theology with a capital T, but that all theologies, born out of the stories of all people, spoken in languages that seemingly seem non-theological, that all people are actually orbiting as minuscule planets around the true center, God. And perhaps this more accurate rearrangement of the theological landscape is the constructive hope that we can offer to those at the center and to those struggling at the margins in the present paradigm. Indeed, if we truly embraced the roominess of God, we can be generous with one another, and we can take the risk of maintaining each of our assertions as provisional to the extent that someone else, theologizing from a different place, may offer an insightful understanding of God's vastness that we could never know or imagine from where we are. I wish to respond now with my preliminary reading of this lecture as a North American woman of Korean heritage. Dr. Tran, I too know a little bit about living in the borderlands. Like those whom you praise for returning to their roots, to the ethnic church of their parents, I have stuck it out in the first-generation immigrant church. When I first entered ministry, I was determined to learn the story of my cultural faith heritage. I served on a staff of 30 pastors, of whom only 3 were women. 2 others were older than my own mom. I was the young, English-speaking female pastor. Yes, I had to wake up while it was still dark and cold to make it to early morning services. And yes, I had to sit in very long staff meetings where the senior pastor spoke most of its duration. However, I gained from there the color of my spirituality and learned the faith language of Christ's body converged with the Korean culture. Yet there were parameters set for the shape of my ministry. I could not envision fully becoming and growing within the confines of an overtly genderized church culture. At staff gatherings, my seat was assigned with the pastors' wives and the other 3 female pastors. You'll be proud that I stayed, that I served in variations of these arrangements in other first-generation and second-generation congregations in the different regions of the United States that my life and learning pursuits had taken me. I was always only a partial version of me in these churches. But I was there. Your heed for me to faithfully return, to reattach, is overbearing. The church that is most home to me today is not the Korean church. It is not the Asian church. It is not the Asian American church. It is the church where I'm asked to preach. No, not just to children, not just to the youth group, to the whole church, where I am invited to teach at the men's weekly meetings, where I am asked to pray with the sick, and where I serve communion. There are no more Korean meals to look forward to after my Sunday morning service. And so I coerced my husband to drive out to LA for some spicy sundubu on Sunday evenings after a long day, a long week of being with my white sisters and brothers. But I am more fully me in this church. I'm more fully becoming a faithful one called to the church. Then there comes the Sunday when, after speaking and delivering the morning sermon, a cousin of a congregation member visiting from Texas, where I used to live, rushes over to shake my hand, and with her bright and hard fuchsia acrylic nails digging into my small hands, she says, "Wow, I think it is just wonderful that you've learned to speak English without an accent." Like so many of you, I live in the borderlands, yearning to find stable place, to be understood, to belong, yet always knowing that I will never quite belong fully. Yet I choose not to defer to a center that seeks to assign me my place, but to constructively be me, growing in and out of my awkwardness and gaining strength to my voice, realizing that while I cannot hold it together, I am held together. I offer a tiny glimpse of my personal narrative to ask all of you, now charged with the responsibility to claim your theological agency as the Asian American Church, and to ask our speaker to consider who is at your table, the table where this contextual, constructive, beautiful Asian American theology will emerge and flourish. For if it is to be contextual, constructive, and beautiful, it must take the risk of inviting threatening bodies who will slow down the process by asking new questions, uncomfortable questions, and problematize whatever picture you had of an emerging Asian American theology? Are you willing to see and to loosen the rigid structures of your theology that inform the polity and ethos of your churches? Are you willing to image God and to speak and teach of God as beyond one gender, and to image the ministry of God and the theological agency entrusted to all made in God's image? Are you prepared to critically examine the male-bodiedness of your pastoral leadership staff, of your session, your elders, your core leaders? Are you prepared to widen the circle of your theology and open the invisible gates in your churches to invite unintended, complex voices that might disturb and make messy whatever neat categories you've knowingly or unknowingly established? I hope to hear a resounding yes someday. Yes. I will joyfully return to take my seat at the table beside you, sharing your humility and gratitude, and together stand in awe at the roominess of grace.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Charlene Jin Lee. And now we'll just move right into, already time is up. Our Isaac Executive Director, Reverend Dr. Tseng.
Thank you, Young Lee. Okay, allow me to put on my ED hat for a moment and just say a few words of thanks to Fuller Seminary, to Mary Givens, and the willingness of Fuller Seminary to take a step and partner with Isaac in this wonderful experience. And I certainly hope that this is one of many in the future. God bless you, Fuller and Mary Givens and everyone who was involved. Also, Young Lee, thanks so much for your leadership and all the hard work. She did all the work here in Southern California of bringing and gathering. So this event could not have been pulled off without such wonderful, gracious, and strong leaders that we have. So thank you all. And I just had to say that because I have to as an ED. But also because it's true, it's wonderful to be surrounded by a great company of strong believers in this vision of giving voice and presence to Asian Americans. My remarks are much more off the cuff, and I think that I want to first thank Dr. Tran, whom I met a few years ago at the AAR meeting. And even before then, we knew each other every now and then. I just want to thank him for this presentation. It was very powerful and rich. There was much to think about and reflect on, and hopefully challenge, because one of the things that I've noticed in a lot of the literature that Asian American evangelicals write is a tendency to avoid some of the issues about power and race and gender and all kinds of other issues that those who are not aware of how important these issues are tend to just throw away as a politically correct issue. But thank you for bringing that into the heart of our conversation, because I don't think any of us as Asian American Christians can escape these realities in our lives. And if we try to deny it, I don't know what world you're living on. Maybe you're a resident alien from a different planet. I don't know. But in any case, my remarks center around the focus of holding on. And I'm actually going to interrogate that a little bit. Is it enough just to hold on and to be faithful? Okay. In fact, holding on may sound like just the last gasp before capitulating to death. So I'm wondering, I'd have the image of someone hanging on to a cliff and just holding on until they inevitably fall apart and die. So I'm wondering whether there's something more positive that can come out of this message. Now, like you, Jonathan, I have. Well, you're sort of starting, but I've lived much of my vocation in ministry as an exile in the service of so-called white theological education. I taught at Rochester and Denver for several years, and in Rochester, for instance, in order to get Asian food, we had to travel 3 hours to Toronto. just to give you a sense of how much we missed that. We had to do that. There was no other option for us. So I understand the sense of longing and exile, and the reason why my family and I moved to the Bay Area, in part was because we needed to be in a multicultural, multiracial, and a place where Asian Americans are affirmed. So in the last 9 years in the Bay Area have been wonderful for me, and I would say that if it wasn't for living in the Bay Area, I don't know what would have happened to my own sense of identity. But one of the sacrifices you make is that once you step out of that arena of servicing so-called white theological education, it's often very difficult to establish yourself and find yourself in a sustainable situation. So the cost of exile also comes rewards. If you go back home to your own community, there is also costs associated with that, as you alluded to, in more emotional and psychological ways. But there's also economic costs. So I would just say that the work that we're doing with Isaac is an example of that, where we're relying on the Asian American Christians to help move this vision forward. If Asian American Christians don't support this, then the costs associated with coming home and trying to give voice will be just, we just don't have a future. So I'm hoping and imploring all of you to consider supporting these endeavors. But anyway, that's a digression. Let me go on and describe a couple of things. First of all, you mentioned, Jonathan, about the importance of looking to history to hold things together. As a church historian, that's a very helpful piece. It helps me feel like historians are valuable in the church. Because without us, honestly, I've said this many times, history is like eating caviar. It's an acquired taste, and most people don't have any interest in it. So consequently, I'm very encouraged that you mentioned the importance of history. But as a historian, I also want to raise the problem to make this problematic. When you actually look at the history, you will find many, many unfamiliar faces and voices, and some voices that are so strange that you can't even, and sometimes it's hard to identify. For example, in the history of Asian American Christianity, how many of us are aware of the voice of a generation of Asian American Christian activists in the 1970s who happened to be part of a more liberal Protestant tradition? The dying embers of this movement can be found in most of our mainline churches. And if you want to do research, you go to the Graduate Theological Union, where I taught for a few years, and the archives are there. But if you actually look into this as an evangelical, these are strange bedfellows to us. Their engagement, their thoughts, their assumptions are all very foreign to us. So how do we hold it together if already we have to deal with the foreignness of the intergenerational divide, but if we explore history, we'll discover a different foreignness. And even beyond that, what about the foreignness of our Asian cultural heritage that includes Asian religions and philosophies? That's not even brought up among us evangelicals, because we believe that the Bible is the Word of God, and that often excludes Confucianism and Taoism and other kinds of traditions, and Buddhism, and so on and so forth. So if we were to really explore our history and try to hold it together, what would that entail for us, both at the practical ministry level and in academic circles? What does it mean to hold it together when our own framework may have a hard time embracing these strangers? So that's one question. Another issue I want to, as a sidebar, I'm like Augustine, I like, distraction and I hope I come back again. Is that you mentioned something about Boaz and his flaccid multiculturalism, which condones in zoo-like conditions differences for the sake of differences. I love to read your article entitled "The Limits of Frank Boaz's Multiculturalism and Augustinian Critique," because Boaz is actually one of my heroes for undermining a 19th century scientific logic that embraced white supremacy as the reality that we're still living in to some degree. So when you critique him, I'm wondering what you're critiquing. Okay, anyway, how do we hold it together in the politics, in the world? And I'm going to read from one of your a quote from one of your wonderful phrases. Asian American Christianity has the potential to be the future because, how do we hold it together if in which the Asian American, as part of the church, are introducing and instantiating into this world of politics called church, by which Asians and Asian Americans, and all race Americans, and generations across generations share a common life within God's infinite generosity and eternal accommodation. Very Harawashian. I appreciate that the church can be a politic. But I think the reality I see is more the politics of the world within the church, more so than the other way around. So how do we actually hold it together if, in truth, our churches are filled with the world's politics? In fact, some might even interpret Jonathan's lecture as an instance of identity politics, talking about yellow Christianity, yay, right? I mean, that sounds like identity politics. So how do we actually talk about being a church, the polity called the church in the world, if in fact the world is actually more in the church? And in that light, is there something more than just holding on that we can engage in? I want to quote from some other authors that I'm familiar with. Anne Tseng wrote in 2000, The Melancholy of Race. And there she says that Asian Americans are suspended from within a racial culture that neither fully accepts nor rejects their presence. And this is a melancholic experience in that there's a sense of absence of place, while others experience the privilege of belonging. The sense of a loss creates a hole or gap that needs constant filling, at which, so basically this assumes that for Asian Americans, when we talk about this being betwixt and between environment, we're actually describing being in a place where we're neither here nor there, and the result is melancholy, a sense of, I don't belong. And for Jonathan to say that trying to find a home is idolatrous, I think it's something I would like to explore a little further. Because is it really true that trying to find a home is idolatry? Or is there something that we can do as Asian Americans for the sake of the common good, whether it's America or Asia or the world? So I'm a little bit curious about what it means to hold things together, because does that give us resources to move forward so that we can hold forth to the future? So we can become generative, as you mentioned, and create and construct a new reality. And so the final point I want to just raise is that as we try to hold together all our differences, do we have a transformative vision of how we can actually transform the changes, the differences within us? We complain a lot about the first generation, and the first generation complains a lot about the second generation. But is there any resources that we can bring to transform each of the generations? So to sum it up, I feel like holding it together sounds too static. I hope that we can envision a holding forth, a moving forth, in a development of leaders in the church, Asian and non-Asian and Asian American, who are more captivated by what can come rather than just holding it together. That's the bottom.
Thank you. Pastor Charles Lee is a pastor in South Bay, and he is known in the world of cyberspace with his idea camp. He's the genius behind that. And welcome.
Yeah. I don't know if I would be called a genius sitting next to these individuals. At my core, I used to be a Bible college professor for about 9 years, and I don't have the same kinds of degrees that those sitting up here do. At the core of my own being as a local pastor is really figuring out, okay, what does this conversation mean? At one level, first of all, let me begin by saying, Dr. Tran, I thought your presentation was refreshingly authentic, and I really appreciate that. I think you were pretty upfront about even the potential points of abrasiveness, and I think that's really healthy for us to hear from our cultural context. And I love the emphasis on theology, dancing with practice. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful imagery. Those two definitely need to live life together. And the deep care that you expressed through the topic. So thank you for just kind of investing in us for a couple of days. And kind of talking about it, like for me personally, I have always kind of found myself as a misfit or fish out of water. And most of my ministry right now does function outside of an Asian American context. Recently, just in preparing for this, I went and looked at my things like speaking schedule. I get to speak several places throughout the month, and I other than Yeongnak, I know Yeongnak is here somewhere, and a couple of maybe one other church, I have not spoken in Asian setting, and I don't know why, because I have nothing against Asian Americans. So, but some of the things that I realized is that, I transitioned out of an Asian American church, specifically Korean American, as I was graduating Bible college because there was an opportunity through a professor of mine. And since then, I really haven't re-engaged that much. And it wasn't because I was frustrated or felt like this was a good time for an exodus. Quite honestly, it may be a shallow reason, but I just wanted a new experience. And it really didn't have much to do with my ethnic background. So I went and I enjoyed that experience thoroughly. And because of that, I think God has opened up several doors that I probably wouldn't have had if I chose to, in some ways, hold on. Although there wasn't a whole lot of angst in me. There was probably angst about the entire church as a whole, but it wasn't necessarily just the Asian Americans. And so, in dealing with this, I like to kind of give you a couple of, insights from a person who may be identified as an exile or sometimes called sellout in some circles. As I do find myself in many different conferences of being the token Asian guy. And so just as a practical outsider in many ways to both worlds. And I think that's why when I read your lecture last night and got the PDF document, I thought, yeah, I can totally relate. And so here's just a couple of notes, and this is really more practices. I think there needs to be a clarification of language. When we throw around terms like tradition and holding on to good history or tradition, quite honestly, maybe because I haven't been in the conversation, I don't know what that is. And as a person who's fairly new to this, it may be good for those, as we re-engage people, is that not to assume that they understand what we're talking about. And I know there's a context here, but maybe we need to reframe the conversation for the broader community. Secondly, is that I think I love the direction that Dr. Tran was going. I'm just not sure that his level of optimism is realistic. In the sense, like, I'm not sure if those who are part of immigrant communities are both ways, whether the first or second generation, those common terms, are willing to come to the table. So there's another layer beyond the conversation itself, the ability to even, how are we going to even get to the same table? Have a conference? It has to be probably deeper than that. And so I'm not really sure. And, I'm usually an overly optimistic guy in most things in life and ministry. But that's an area of concern because I've seen different churches try that, and maybe it's the wrong methodology, but there seems to be a failure when those two parties come together. Either one takes charge or the other. And so maybe some common points that as some of you are leading churches and institutions is developing a more intentional posture of listening well. And that's a practice that most of us in America as a whole are really not good at. Is the ability to actually listen without thinking of a comeback, without thinking of what agenda I'm going to push, but really knowing and getting to know the soul that sits in front of you or stands in front of you. And it's going to take relationship and time to actually develop enough of a context to even have this conversation. And converse in motion. Don't wait for the conversation to initiate motion. I think the best wisdom that God provides is when we're actually moving. So we don't have to have all of the solutions, all of the methodologies, but we got to start somewhere. Maybe even like it's not a total stab in the dark, but start somewhere. Go in some direction, maybe as a pastoral staff or others, just to at least like minimum through some minimal relationship saying, obviously both sides know there could be some alternative here. So even with that little straw of a foundation, maybe push forward a little bit. And clarifying what are some of our objectives. Because I have a suspicion that the objectives of the first generation may be different from the second and third. And what's the methodology? I find a lot of young second and third generation leaders who have maybe shifted philosophically, but default to an old methodology as well. And so I'm wondering, okay, you're trying to solve problems that are new, and yet you default to an old system, in part because that's the only system they grew up in. And so you almost need, at times, an outsider voice that can think through systems, maybe. Maybe not so much cultural dynamics, but maybe some of this are environmental, organizational environments that maybe we need to engage a little bit further. And I think there's a need for better cultural architects, and that's the language that churches like Mosaic here in Pasadena use. But this understanding that, the way that we develop creativity and room for problem solving is we need to become, as leaders, better cultural architects. In other words, instead of thinking of solutions, think in terms of environments. Creating the right kind of environment where these solutions can actually arise to the surface. So you don't have to solve everything, but can you create an environment in your churches where these kinds of conversations with intentional action steps can actually take place? And so, I think in terms of this, maybe it's not about becoming one again. Maybe there's a third alternative we're not thinking of. Maybe that's worth an exploration. Maybe there is a common place that instead of the second trying to reconnect with the first trying to be progressive enough to invite the second generation, maybe there's a third option where both parties bring something good to the table and choose to say, you know what, we're going to take on a third identity, a third kind of culture, if you will. And so those are things to kind of consider. And forgive me, these are like broad 30,000-foot concepts that I don't have a plan for. Okay. But I think about this when I think about culture and cultural, things like that. And I see the 2-minute warning. A couple of other things. They didn't get it. You did? You got it? Okay, good. So I just wasted 10 seconds right now. Think in terms of spheres and layers. I think Dr. Tran points out rightly that we do need people who really hold on, but we also need others who go into arenas where they are the total minority voice. And one of the ways that I think we can do this, and I'm kind of I'm kind of biased to this, is technology, specifically social media. I think Asian Americans need to tell their story better, because there are great stories here. So how do you platform that? And which is ironic, because our churches are filled with geeks and designers and storytellers and filmmakers, and it's just ironic that we have the technology, the education, and yet we can't tell the story. And maybe our systems don't allow for the stories to be told. Maybe our culture doesn't encourage the arts to tell the story of our great tradition. Because I bet if young people understood our heritage, because I know my parents' generation, they took a post-war country and made it a world power. And if that's true, there must be something there to be gained that even younger generations will say, you know what, I'm a part of that. Sure, it cost us our family. Sure, it cost us the breaking up of a lot of churches. But even in the midst of the rubble, there's always good. And so how do we highlight those stories? And I think social media is a new frontier where the playing field has become flat. If you can read Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat, there's a flatness of opportunity. If you're willing to work hard, you can become a voice in social media. And so to think about that, and then the other thing is, like, isn't white the sum of all colors? Maybe we need to reframe what it means to be white. And maybe that white can be broader than an ethnic background, but it can be actually a beautiful collection of all the colors. Thank you.
Next, Dr. Reverend Shin is the full-time EN congregation pastor of Open Door Church in LA and full-time faculty at Talbot Theological Seminary. I don't know how he does it. You are on, sir.
Well, thank you for being here. And Jonathan, I thoroughly enjoyed your talk both today and yesterday. And I'd like to address two specific areas. One is about seminaries and seminarians, as well as the second idea of the idea of partnership. But again, just to begin my story, I actually grew up here in Pasadena in the 60s. And Pasadena was a much different place than it is now. I am a second generation American born. I was born at Huntington Memorial Hospital here in Pasadena. And growing up here, I really thought I was white. So in the schools that I went to, in the church I grew up in, which was Lake Avenue, I was pretty much the lone Asian. And to highlight my unawareness of my own Asianness, I would be in grade school and people would come up to me kind of mocking me and saying, "Do you know Kung Fu or Bruce Lee?" And I would just kind of, "No, I don't. Who are they?" I had no idea who these folks were. And so based on that unawareness, as well as my own palate tendencies towards Taco Bell and Tops Burgers, I didn't really understand my Asianness until I went to college. And I went to college at UCLA, which is known for being the University of Caucasians lost among Asians. And it was there that I had my first real experience with kimchi and Asians and this whole experience. I was part of a Christian fraternity at UCLA that had a lot of Asians. The nickname of the fraternity, the motto was the Christ-centered fraternity, but the nickname of it was the Rice-centered fraternity. And it was through that time at UCLA that I really engaged and began to understand my Asianness. I went to white churches. I perceived myself as white, all of that until I would say about 25. And so it wasn't until after I graduated from college that I went to my first Asian church. It happened to be Yongnok Church. And I only went there because they needed a worship leader. And I happened to play, at the time, which was radical, a plug-in 12-string, steel string electric guitar. And that was kind of radical in the 80s. And I used to get censored all the time for having songs that had, unusual beat and so forth. But in that experience, what I realized and what was starting to kind of come to fruition was this idea that I really saw not only a need, but a niche where that I could uniquely speak into people because my background was radically different than everyone else's background that I had met with. And so kind of interestingly enough, I think I'm going through some of the processes that Jonathan was mentioning in that now in my later 40s, I'm starting to re-engage back into the Asianness, specifically of the Korean church. Now, let me just say, first of all, and qualify this, it hasn't been an easy experience. I went through lots of hardship. I suffered through different pains. I had been at a previous church where I'd spent a good portion of my life, 15 years, investing only to be released on Christmas Sunday. That was a very painful gift, if you could call it that. It ended up really being a gift because God was kind of bringing me out of that and allowing other things to happen in my life at the time. It was right at that time that I was engaged, that I got married. So I started much later. I got married at 41, so much later than most of you. And then I became a dad pretty early on as well. So these were experiences that I had during this break time of my opportunity to be out of the Asian church. In 2005, I was called back to an Asian church, of all things a Korean church. And the months and even the year prior to that, I was making claims like, I will never go back to the Asian church. Or forget the Korean church. I mean, I didn't want to even go to heaven because there's 12 elders in heaven, right? And so these are kind of, it was just my angst coming out. And through the help of counseling, professional counseling, and imprecatory psalm prayers, if you know what that is, God was able to restore me and to renew me. Now, given that background, let me just tell you my goal. My goal is to be a reformer. I would like, and again, I see the bride of Christ, the church, with all its blemishes and faults and everything. It's like HD TV. You see it very clearly. But join the world. I mean, we are all tainted with sin. We are all affected by the fall. I think our goal as people in ministry, and leaders especially, is to be redemptive. And so I've taken that call to continue to stay in the Korean church, and I just love my church. I really, really do. I never thought I would say that, but I really, really do love the church sincerely and deeply. And so with that understanding, I'm trying to rethink, redo, reframe everything, including, as Randy was asking earlier, the theology of how that's going to look and how it's going to work. And so the partnership, as Jonathan was mentioning, of theology in the church, it's a must. He said it's not theology if it doesn't become doxological and work in a proper context of the church. And I wholeheartedly say amen to that. So let me tell you how I'm doing that, and I'll offer my two options here. I have the privilege of also teaching full-time in a seminary. So my part-time gig is the church, and my full-time gig is teaching in the seminary. And so in the seminary that I work at, we have the requirements of, publishing and teaching. I teach a full load. I teach 4 classes a semester, which is overload, actually. So that's quite a lot. And then I'm trying to write and publish and do all these other things, and then, church is on the side. Plus, I have 2 small kids, a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. So I don't sleep much. I pray a lot, okay? And so here's my deal. You were talking yesterday about seminaries, Jonathan, and just how maybe sometimes they're irrelevant and how we're not helping people who are in seminaries, specifically Asian Americans, because they have no one to talk to. And I totally resonate with that, because when I was in seminary, that was the case. There was not a single Asian professor at the seminary that I went to. And again, this is when I was just starting to discover my Asianness. So I'm like, I got to talk to someone. And the only person I really talked to was my father, who was very helpful in this. But now I'm so thankful, because the seminary that I teach at, we have 8 full-time Asian professors, including 3 women. I'm so thankful for that. So here's the challenge for those of you who are educators who are in seminaries. And that is, if you're a professor, yes, teach. Do your best. Yes, publish. We got to get some publishing out there. Yes, let's kind of reframe theology and Bible exposition, all that. But here's the thing that I'm focusing a third of my time on in my academics and my teaching, and that is mentorship. I've got to mentor my students. I came back from a wonderful experience this last summer. I got to be with Dr. Howard Hendricks at Dallas, and that whole idea of mentorship just was reaffirmed in my own life. And so I came back with the fervor. And I did some, quote, dangerous things. For example, first time in like a few years, I'm teaching an undergrad class. I have 41 students in that class. One of the requirements I made was you have to have a 2-hour mentorship time with me during the course of the semester. You do the math. That's a lot of hours. But I'll tell you, that's been extremely valuable. As a seminary professor, we have the privilege and we have the opportunity to speak truth into people's lives because they're looking into us and asking us for direction. I was teaching a New Testament survey class last night. I gave a quiz. It was funny. It was accidental how the setup. Every other row, the front person was an Asian. Okay, and the white folks were just handing me the papers, and then the Asians, every time, they'd kind of do this thing, where they're cuffing their arm, and they have utmost respect. So please, if you're an educator in seminaries, don't be like Charles Barkley and says, I'm not a role model. You are a role model by virtue of your role, your position, your authority, and what you have to say to them. Second thing, and I'll conclude with this. We have a lot of leaders from a lot of different places. We have Melanie, we have Tommy from parachurches, we have Pastor Michael, we have many other pastors here as well. I want to suggest to you that we need to partner together. Let's get the seminaries together, because we have them at a later time. Churches, you have them for the lifetime. Parachurches, you probably have them in college. If we could strategize and say, how can we line this up so that we create not just theologians and not just practitioners in church, but godly Christian Asians, then this is going to be a solution that I think it's right in front of us. We just need to start to have the conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I take that as a promise that we will overcome gendered and racialized resource barriers. So thank you. And Ben Shin brought his whole church, Open Door Church, sitting at the table with us. And Melanie Ma Chow has been crying out in the wilderness for almost 3 decades. She is full alum. She is a staff under JAM, and I'll let you spell out, Japanese Evangelical Missionary Society, and she's also a USC campus pastor.
Thank you, Young.
An AWOL co-member, Asian American Women in Leadership.
Thank you, Young. It's a privilege to be able to respond to Dr. Chan's second paper. And to begin with, I want to give an example of what the yellowing of America can look like. Yesterday's panelists talked about Asian Americans and food, and yellowing can be likened to mainstreaming all things Asian into American life. And so why is it that more Asian Americans Yelp? I see lots of Asians on the Yelp pages talking about food, but if you take, for example, that we've mainstreamed sushi, teriyaki sauce, and as I drove in today, I passed Yoshinoya, and their rice bowl is not just the teriyaki bowl, it's a Mexican bowl. So we're taking to heart what Dr. Tran has mentioned to us about the importance of what the yellowing can be as a redemptive hope for the future of the church. My contacts, and I'm glad Young introduced me, because usually when I come to these conferences, by the time I introduce the name of my group, Asian American Christian Fellowship, that is a campus ministry of gems, and I spell it out, and then I tell you my name, my full name, I'm done. They go, your 2 minutes is over. So today I'm glad I'm able to articulate and share some of the things that I've learned about being from the parachurch context, from campus ministry arena that can apply to the future of both the Asian church, Asian American church, as well as the church in America. And so I think I really appreciate what Dr. Chan brought out, and I wanted to respond to a few things. I think that enough said about gender. Let me give you a preface. When I was thinking about this, sometimes I play with words. And so because I've been involved with AACF for 22 years, it has been part of my major ministry, but I do all sorts of other stuff, as people know. But I've gone acronymic, so if you're taking notes, everything will be AACF. So assessing a certain future for the church is AACF. So I want to, enough said, but I want to at least reiterate, as Young said, crying out in a long time was, I am so glad that I'm not the only Asian woman here. And it's wonderful to see that God has already articulated and expressed and affirmed and acknowledged and brought to this table. This room looks very balanced as far as men and women here together in the Asian American church. So if this is the representation, I praise God for what I see as I look across the room. But acknowledging and affirming Christ in females, you probably say enough said, but I don't think there's been enough said. Being students of being in a posture to work with students, it's important that they see both sides, male and female, working together. And I think once I finished seminary, I was all ready to go back to the campus, and then it was our turn to be parents, and I had a daughter. And I wanted to acknowledge Bert, because I was like, how do I do this? I have a daughter, she's little, and Bert says, just come. So people have known me as the woman that carried a baby around. People ask me now, where is she? She's at school, if you want to know. She's now 13. She's beautiful. But it's because of this village that she's able to see and model. And so in the same way, our students have seen men and women serving together and just doing it like Jesus must be Nike. He says, he just told me, just do it. Just take your daughter. And so as a campus minister on the campus of USC, people, good Chinese moms with well-intentioned hearts said, you're going down to USC with your daughter? And I said, no, God is sending me, so she'll be fine. But we need to acknowledge that women have a place and that men, too, can come alongside. There were times that my husband would be rolling the stroller. My daughter knew the stroller for only her first 3 years, and we just did it. We wanted to work with the students because we love them. I think one of the things that leads to is the important role of acknowledging that we celebrate family for wherever you are. There is a new family for you. If you're on campus, you make a family there. You find friends, you hang out, they feed you. You find a good campus minister. We've invited people into our homes, they've eaten our food. And I think because Asian Americans, as sociologists talk, are group-oriented, and the model of encouraging family life, Jonathan said, the importance of being community, to share, to collaborate is so important. You know, that we don't have all the answers, but somebody else does in the kingdom. Asian American Christian friends, the importance of doing the work of evangelism. If we're not doing evangelism, we won't have these campus groups, we won't have churches, our pews will be empty if we don't tell others about Jesus and invite them to the party. I think the importance of storytelling of Jesus in our daily lives and just inviting people to hear our stories is the way that we can yellow the church, is to bring our unique stories as a redemptive hope to what we've experienced, to make our challenges a blessing, to learn from them, to be a student of the culture. Affirmation and approval via calling, I think, is foundational. AACF again, but affirmation and approval via calling is foundational. It's leadership development. It's how we look at the Bible through a different lens, through the Asian American lens of seeing calling, reflecting on God's invitations in Scripture, the call narratives of Abraham, Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ruth speak to the Asian American psyche of empowerment that brings a desire, that quells the desire for role models. People will serve if they are invited. I am on this panel because Young said, would you come and would you speak? It was an invitation that I wanted to see, and how else am I inviting others to the table? We need to embrace our unique identity. God forbid there would be Melanie Chow clones, but intergenerational leadership is important. So I still want to be at the table, even though sometimes I think I'm too old to be in campus ministry. Where are the young ones? I didn't invite them. Maybe that's why they're not there. But in the same way, intergenerational leadership was important. In these same call narratives, Moses needed Jethro, Ruth and Naomi together, and how in community do we embrace that together? Assessing and addressing the confusing future of today's youth. And I think one of the things that we're doing on the campus and seeing student lives is how do we become a student of the culture that our Asian American students are facing? And how do we bring that into the church? What are the things facing our youth that the church may not seem to see as relevant, but that will not keep them in the church? What generational issues like leadership do youth have the ability to own their faith, to be given responsibility, and can be viewed not as a power struggle that they would wrestle and just move out or leave, but how do we allow them to create and craft new ministries that they can express themselves, regardless of whether they're Asian American, Mexican American, Latino American, or whatever color along the spectrum. What are we enabling them to do best what they can do? And again, as Charles noted, how do we embrace technology? I too think we're the geekiest, high-tech, gotta have the new toys, but are we using them for God's purposes, or are they just sitting in our house? You know, do we take, I was like shocked that we don't have PowerPoint this morning. I had this nice little PowerPoint to show you, but I thought, oh no, we're not embracing the technology to the fullest. And then I think academic application claimed at Fuller. And I think one of the things that I really am thankful for is the way that Fuller has been instrumental. And the academy, the seminaries have been instrumental in reaching out and inviting to the conversation. I am so blessed that the way that the professors here have address the Asian American issue. I think of Dr. Bobby Clinton that talks about the importance of leadership, to have a learning posture. As Asian Americans, we get to college and then our education sometimes gets done. But we still need to learn, and maybe it's time for us to, again, fill the seminaries and be prepared to do second career ministries, to be best at what we're doing, to have that double major. Dr. Tran said, maybe we need theology and fill in the blank, engineering, law, medicine, education, psychology, to retain our theological insights, but also then to be, to excel in our communities, to be the best engineers, to be the best whatever study we are studying. And that's why I think, you know, I get to do this full-time as a campus minister, but my husband is bivocational in the sense that he is an engineer, he's a drinking water specialist, he works 8 hours a day or more, and then comes onto the campus and sits with other potential engineers and then valuing and embracing what it means to be a Christian, but also to be an engineer. And so in conclusion, I just want to say that the future hope of the Asian American Church is in the same kind of thing of yellow. I don't know if you noticed our students here who are helping are wearing yellow, but I was thinking about yellow last night. And I think what we need to do is, in order to be redemptive hope, is we need to really take to heart that old saying about what do you do when people throw you lemons? You make lemonade. And the challenges and the difficulties, it would have been easy to just come here and tell you all my struggles of what it was to be a woman in ministry and how did you get to this point? You know, it wasn't. It was being able to redeem, to make lemonade. And I am so blessed that God has, enabled me to embrace those things and then to see the fruit of that. Lemon as a fruit. So to see the fruit made out. And so I encourage you to look to the youth and to invest in them, to invite them, to bring them to the table, but intergenerationally strengthen what we bring so that we are noticed, that we are not forgotten, that we don't blend in.
Thank you all so very much. 11:30 was supposed to be a breakout session, and you already lost your break time, but I think it is just to give Dr. Tran maybe quick response. I mean quick. Here, come here.
Thank you once again, panel, for your splendid responses. And I'd love to chat with all of you guys about each of those things. I do want to spend some time speaking to Professor Jin's incredibly brilliant and incisive comments because I think they warrant our attention, and it's been to my failure to not highlight and speak to the critical issue of gender in the Asian American Church enough. So I want to be clear about this simply because I don't mind if you guys misunderstand or misrepresent many things I say, but this is important because it has implications for how people view their own ministries. I am not saying the only option is to stay in first-generation churches. I am not saying the only option is to stay in first-generation churches. Please do not say that I am saying that, because one day I'm going to be at a Chinese restaurant. I'm going to meet a busboy who dresses very poorly, and because he lost his job because he spent so much time going to 6 a.m. prayer meetings. And he's going to say to me, Tran, I was going to leave, but I heard you said I need to stay. So this does have import, and I want to be clear. That is not what I'm saying. What I am saying is leaving is not our only option. And I want us to spend as much attention and highlight as much as possible, simply, if only to create a stopgap in the vast trajectory of what I see as simply a leaving. So please understand that that's not what I'm saying. Let me point out why I think this is important in relationship to gender specifically. If we are suggesting that the only option is to leave, specifically on the issue of gender, that to fully enter into and to celebrate and to be honored as an Asian American woman, as an ordained Asian American woman who's a teacher of theology, that the only thing we can do is leave. If we suggest that, then what we are suggesting that those who stay, who are our mothers and our sisters and our daughters, that somehow they have less of a claim about their femininity and gender and less of a claim about God's created goodness in those things. Mm-hmm. And I don't think either of us want to suggest either of those things. And so I'm not saying we have to stay or we have to leave. What I am asking for is a moment of consideration for all the vast options. What we need to do is dream our way out of these present conditions. And these conditions include the oppressing realities of gender discrimination and oppression and patriarchalism within the Asian American Church. I personally think if there is a reason to leave the first generation church, one very good reason is because it cannot or often does not celebrate the ministries of people like Reverend Chow. To the extent that it cannot do that, that is a good reason to leave. But in leaving, I also want us to mourn what we're leaving. Because we cannot forget that the very reasons that we feel the need to leave the crushing patriarchal realities within that church, if we leave that, we are also damning that church to the fate of its patriarchal presumptions. I am not under any presumption that this is an easy battle. I have, as a man, no idea what this is like. But if we leave for that good reason, I want us also to take time to mourn what we're leaving. Two other points. First, there's a type of overbearing that I obviously don't mind being. The kind of overbearing that makes you, as an ordained pastor, is an unacceptable overbearing. And I apologize for that. To you and to Reverend Chow and to all the women in this fellowship, if I have suggested that, well, let me rephrase that. I have suggested that. And I am thankful for my blindnesses to be called out and to be made visible, because I am incredibly vulnerable to massive modes of closure in the most unfaithful ways. And so I apologize to the extent that that has been overbearing. I certainly have not intended that, but I recognize it's very possible that I did that. It is never my intention to undermine or undercut the ministry that God has called our Asian American sisters to. The third point is more of a practical point. I won't be here for the business meeting because as Reverend Dr. Jin reminded me, I need to go work on my Texas accent. But I do, and I say this publicly maybe because it will give me some purchase on the powers that be. I would commend highly that we consider Reverend Dr. Jin to be the keynote speaker for this occasion next year. I think she has the power and articulation to name the many things that need to be named. So I humbly submit that to you. And again, I thank you very much for your considerations.
If you all agree, Charlene, you're saying yes, right? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a wonderful feast, and your breakout session need to be the same one as yesterday so that you can go deep. And I'd like to just make an announcement that there is such a thing as AATF, Asian American Theological Fellowship, on this campus. Daniel Lee, Angel Wu, they are the founders, and Hannah Lee, and also Logos Evangelical Seminary has Inheritance magazine available at the promotional table. And also, it seems like through the breakout session, I realized my old book, Cultural Tug of War, is still a current issue, so I brought a copy there by Abingdon. And Dr. Mark Lau Branson, who is holding my book, is putting it into action. Youngnak and Evergreen will be the site of church-based field ed education. So we will be providing a venue, and students need to sign up to make that happen. And also last but the least is Melanie, Chow, Charlene, and myself, and many other ordained women in this room is available for preaching anytime. Whenever Asian American churches call and come and preach, I drop everything and say yes. So we are available. And thank you very much. Thank you. You have not been overbearing. You're a great ally and brother. And patio is also available for your breakout session if you want some fresh air. Jonathan Wu, do you have any other announcement regarding? Mm-hmm.
Our hope is that we can continue what took place yesterday. And so I know that there are some people that just came today and are not currently connected to a group. And so what I wanted to do was that we have 4 different topics, and these topics were identified by the Asian American Fuller students here as the critical issues for their own personal and leadership development. And so what we're doing as a community is actually serving their benefit as we seek to provide proactive strategies and recommendations to the seminary for Isaac to consider, as well as all of us in the Asian American church community. So the 4 topics that we're discussing again are the future of Asian American pastoral leadership, the future of Asian American women in ministry, the future of intergenerational Asian American churches, and the future of theological formation in Asian American churches. So I'm going to go through each of the categories and ask the moderators that are here to stand. So I know that you're not sitting necessarily with them. So if I can have Joyce Chan. These are for the pastoral leadership. Joyce Chan, also Kenneth Ko. Joyce, why don't you remain standing? And Victor Kwan. Is Victor? Okay. And then Deborah O facilitated a group yesterday, but she was not able to be here today. I'm going to be facilitating her group. So if you're part of the pastoral leadership group, go to their tables and join around the tables after I go through all the lists. The second area is Asian American Women in Ministry, and that's Debbie Jin. Debbie, are you? Oh, she stepped out. And then Eileen Hong. Eileen, where? Eileen's there, okay? And if you'll see that the tables are marked by color. The third topic was intergenerational Asian American churches. Tommy Joe is back there. James Yu. James is right here. Ken Kong is there. And then Rosa Moy. So it's right around this area. So, and if you were not a part of a group and are interested in, again, any of these groups, please join these groups. Final one was Theological Formation in Asian American Churches. It should be on this side. Min, Han Huen, and also Bo Lim. They're both there, okay? And just a reminder that one of the things that we're hoping to take place during the next hour, not only will you have a chance to debrief Dr. Tran's talk and speak in particular how this relates to hopeful future outcome in your particular topic, but we do want you to articulate some specific strategies and follow-ups as to how Fuller, Isaac, and even church leaders can move ahead in this area. I'm going to ask, after things get settled, that the moderator identify someone to come by and pick up a couple of pieces of white paper. We'll ask you to write that because after lunch, we're going to have a closing opportunity for each of the moderators to briefly summarize what you have talked about. One thing I should also note is that lunch will be brought to your table. It's a box lunch. So whether you stay here or you congregate outside, lunch will be brought to your table. You can continue your discussion through lunch. I know that at 1 o'clock or so is we're going to be coming back here. So I think that's all I wanted to summarize. So, okay? So again, try to find out where your facilitator, moderator was yesterday and join their table. And for those who did come today, please join any of the existing tables.